The suburbs of Florida often carry an image of peace, a place where the lawns are trimmed to perfection, neighbors wave politely as they pass, and every driveway seems to shelter a family striving for stability. Among the rows of pastel-colored houses and picket fences lived Officer Frank Miller, a man who seemed to embody everything the neighborhood admired. He carried himself with an air of authority, the kind that came naturally after years on the police force. His uniform was always pressed, his shoes polished, and his presence demanded respect. Parents told their children that Officer Miller kept their streets safe. To outsiders, he was the picture of discipline and order, the kind of man who never let anything slip out of place. Frank's life, at least from the outside, appeared perfectly arranged. He had a wife who managed the household, a teenage daughter, and a reputation that extended beyond his cul-de-sac. When people in town discussed crime or trouble, they often mentioned Frank's name with confidence, believing he could handle whatever chaos the world threw at them. He was invited to community barbecues, church events, and local gatherings where his presence reassured the residents that their neighborhood was protected. To many, he represented the ideal suburban guardian, firm, loyal, and unwavering, but respectability can be a mask, and behind Frank's stern smile lived a man shaped by prejudice. His fellow officers knew him as outspoken, often leaning into racist remarks during off-duty conversations. These comments rarely made their way outside the station, but within the force, his reputation was not spotless. While he kept his public life clean, his private thoughts betrayed something darker. He carried grudges against people who looked different from him, and his idea of order was one that kept him at the center. Yet none of this filtered into the perfect suburban image he worked so hard to maintain. To his neighbors, Frank was simply a man of tradition, a proud officer of the law. Frank's home was another symbol of control. The grass was never more than half an inch too long, the paint on the shutters was fresh, and the flag in his front yard was always perfectly positioned. Inside, his rules governed every detail. The family ate dinner at the table, conversations were brief, and his word was final. His daughter, Emily, learned early that challenging him led to silence or punishment. His wife endured his moods with practiced patience, filling the home with an uneasy calm. Though the walls stood solid and the windows sparkled, tension often lingered in the air. The home looked inviting from the street, but its foundation rested on fear. For years, this routine life went unquestioned. Frank's neighbors saw what he wanted them to see. A man whose life was structured, who believed in discipline, and who upheld the values of the community. No one knew the cracks forming beneath the surface. His colleagues overlooked his remarks, his family endured his control, and his neighbors accepted the version of him that waved from the porch each morning. But perfection cannot last forever. Hidden beneath the uniform and the polished exterior was a secret that would one day shatter the illusion of suburban peace, turning the man everyone thought they knew into the center of a tragedy that no one saw coming. Across the street from the Miller household lived Marcus Reed, a young man whose life looked very different from the orderly world Frank tried to project. At 22, Marcus had already faced setbacks that weighed heavily on him. Once a promising college athlete, his dreams of finishing school were cut short when financial struggles and personal challenges forced him to drop out. He returned home to help his single mother, who worked long hours to keep their modest household afloat. The Reeds' home was smaller, older, and carried the wear of years of hard work without the luxury of constant upkeep. Still, what it lacked in perfection it made up for in warmth. Neighbors described Marcus as polite, energetic, and generous, a young man who often helped his mother's friends carry groceries or mow their lawns without asking for anything in return. From the very beginning, Marcus and Frank lived as if they belonged to two different worlds, even though their houses stood only a short distance apart. Frank's sense of superiority meant he rarely exchanged more than a stiff nod with Marcus's family. He viewed them through the lens of his own prejudice, never acknowledging the kindness or determination that others admired in Marcus. Yet despite this outward hostility, Frank found himself unable to ignore the young man. There was something magnetic about Marcus's presence, his confidence, his athletic build, the way he carried himself without apology. For someone like Frank, who spent his days hiding behind strict rules and rigid beliefs, Marcus represented a dangerous kind of freedom. It began subtly. Late-night glances from across the street, casual moments when Frank noticed Marcus returning from a jog or chatting with friends on the porch. Frank's interest soon grew into something he could not suppress. At first, he justified his attention as curiosity, maybe even suspicion. He told himself he was only keeping an eye on Marcus, the way an officer watches over potential trouble. But what started as an excuse quickly turned into desire, a craving that only deepened the more he tried to fight it. Their first encounter was almost accidental. One evening, Frank spotted Marcus sitting alone in his car, music playing softly as the streetlights glowed. Against his better judgment, Frank approached, pretending to ask about a noise complaint. The conversation was brief, awkward, yet charged with something unspoken. From that night on, the line between their worlds blurred. Under the cover of darkness, Frank returned. The car became their meeting place, hidden from curious eyes, a space where both men shed the masks they wore in the daylight. For Marcus, the relationship was complicated. Frank was older, authoritative, and carried views Marcus had spent his life fighting against. Yet the secrecy, the intensity, and the forbidden nature of their encounters created a pull that neither could resist. As weeks passed, their meetings grew more frequent. Frank, who had spent years policing his image, began taking risks that shocked even himself. He would slip away after his family had gone to bed, his footsteps quiet, his lies rehearsed. Inside Marcus's home, or parked along darkened back roads, they built a bond that was fragile and volatile, fueled by both fear and passion. What should have remained impossible quickly became an addiction. The affair was not only a betrayal of Frank's family, but also a direct contradiction of the hateful views he had carried for years. This inner conflict only added to the danger. By day, Frank continued his role as the disciplined officer and strict father. By night, he surrendered to the very life he condemned in public. The more he tried to balance the two, the thinner the line became between the man his community believed him to be and the man he truly was. No one suspected a thing. The neighbors waved from their porches, unaware of the late-night whispers and hurried footsteps across the street. To the outside world, Frank and Marcus remained distant, even hostile. But in reality, their secret had already taken root, binding them together in a way that could not stay hidden forever. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed, and when that happened, the consequences would be explosive. Emily Miller had grown up in a house built on strict rules and unspoken tension. Her father's authority loomed over every part of her life, from the way she dressed to the friends she was allowed to see. She had long since learned to avoid confrontation, slipping into silence whenever his temper flared. Yet despite the rigid control, she remained observant, a quiet witness to the cracks in the foundation of their so-called perfect family. It was Emily who first sensed that something about her father's routine had shifted. He was leaving the house late at night, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in plain clothes, always with vague explanations that rang hollow. At first, she dismissed it as work, emergencies, late patrols, or unplanned shifts. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. His absences stretched longer, and when he returned, he carried an unease that even his silence could not mask. Emily began to notice smaller details. Phone calls taken in hushed tones, the way he slipped into the garage before driving off, and the occasional faint scent of cologne that was not his own. At dinner, his mind often wandered, leaving his wife to fill the silence while he stared into space. For a man so meticulous about appearances, these changes stood out sharply. Emily's suspicions grew, though she could not yet piece together the truth. Her curiosity soon transformed into obsession. She wanted answers, and once she made up her mind, she was relentless in her pursuit. One night, when Frank slipped out after midnight, Emily decided to follow. She waited a few minutes, then crept into her car and kept her distance as he drove through the quiet streets. Her heart pounded as she tailed him, headlights dimmed, terrified of being caught. She expected to see him pull into the station or perhaps stop at a colleague's house. Instead, she watched as he turned down a familiar street and parked near Marcus Reed's home. Emily froze, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. She stayed far enough back to remain unseen, but close enough to witness her father disappear into the neighbor's driveway. Minutes turned to hours, and when he finally emerged, he wasn't the same stern, guarded man she had always known. He looked almost vulnerable, his posture softened, his movements less deliberate. It was then that she realized the truth she could hardly comprehend. Her father was having an affair, and it was with the young man who lived across the street. The discovery burned inside her. Emily had grown up hearing her father's racist words, the venom he directed toward people like Marcus. He had built his identity around hatred, around the image of a man who defended tradition and authority. To find him betraying not only his family but also his own beliefs shattered everything she thought she knew. She began keeping track of his late-night visits, writing down times and dates, building a quiet record of his betrayal. What started as shock quickly morphed into fury. She could not reconcile the father she had feared all her life with the man sneaking into Marcus's home under the cover of night. In her mind, the betrayal was not just personal, but catastrophic. If the secret came out, their family would be ruined, her mother humiliated, and her own life dragged into scandal. The man she had once idolized had revealed himself to be weak, hypocritical, and deceitful. Each passing day made her more restless. The silence at the dinner table grew heavier, her father's late-night departures more unbearable. She no longer saw him as a protector, but as a fraud who had poisoned their family with lies. The resentment festered, coiling tighter until it felt like a storm building inside her. Emily's fixation consumed her. She spent nights staring at the ceiling, imagining the whispers of neighbors, the humiliation at school, the shame of being known as the daughter of a man who lived two lives. The pressure mounted with every secret rendezvous she documented. She didn't know it yet, but the anger and betrayal building inside her were setting the stage for a decision that would alter all their lives forever. The night that would change everything began like so many others. The air outside was heavy with Florida's humid heat, and the cicadas buzzed in the distance as the neighborhood slowly drifted into silence. Inside the Miller home, Emily waited in the shadows, her thoughts tangled in a storm of rage, shame, and desperation. For weeks she had watched her father slip out under the cover of darkness, his excuses no longer believable, his lies as transparent as glass. She had uncovered his secret and carried it like a weight pressing on her chest, suffocating her with every passing day. That night she reached the point of no return. Earlier in the evening, she had moved quietly through the kitchen, her fingers trembling as they closed around the handle of a long, sharp knife. She placed it beside her on the couch, hidden beneath a blanket, her body rigid as she waited for the sound of her father's car pulling into the driveway. Hours passed like days, and the longer she sat there, the more her fury fermented. She thought of the years of fear, of the rules that had silenced her, of the man who demanded respect while living a lie. Each thought sharpened her anger into something dangerous, something she could no longer control. At last, the headlights appeared across the lawn. Frank stepped out of the car, straightening his posture as if to slip back into the role of the dutiful husband and father. He walked up the driveway, oblivious to the storm brewing inside his own home. When he opened the front door, the usual quiet greeted him. But this time Emily was waiting. The confrontation erupted the moment their eyes met. The truth, unspoken yet undeniable, filled the space between them. In Emily's mind, she saw not just her father, but the hypocrisy, the humiliation, and the betrayal of everything he had ever forced upon her. Her anger broke free like a dam bursting. In a blur of motion, she lunged forward, the knife glinting in her hand. Frank, caught off guard, had no time to defend himself. The first strike was followed by another, and another, each blow fueled by years of resentment. The silence of the house shattered with the sound of struggle, the walls absorbing the chaos that had been building for so long. Within minutes, it was over. Frank lay on the living room floor, his lifeless body sprawled across the carpet that only hours before had been part of their ordinary home. Emily stood above him, her chest heaving, her hands trembling, the knife slick with blood. Shock washed over her as the reality of what she had done settled in. The man who had once seemed unbreakable was gone, reduced to nothing more than a body at her feet. But the panic that followed was just as consuming as the rage that had driven her. She knew there would be questions, investigations, and consequences she could not face alone. In her desperation, she reached for the one person tied to the secret that had set this tragedy in motion. She dialed Marcus, her voice shaky as she told him to come immediately. Minutes later, he stood in the doorway, his eyes widening at the sight before him. The weight of the situation pressed down on both of them. For Marcus, the risk was immense. His connection to Frank was dangerous enough, but now he stood in the middle of a crime scene that could easily seal his fate. Together, they scrambled to find a way out. Panic guided their actions as they dragged Frank's body toward the garage, every movement leaving behind traces of desperation. They loaded him into his own car, hoping to stage the scene as an accident, something that would deflect suspicion away from Emily. The plan was reckless, fueled not by reason, but by fear. As they shut the car door and wiped their trembling hands, neither of them realized just how quickly the fragile cover story would unravel. By the time the night faded into morning, the Miller home no longer held the image of order and discipline it once projected. It had become a stage for violence, betrayal, and a desperate attempt to bury the truth. What Emily had unleashed could not be hidden for long, and the consequences of that night were already waiting to surface. The attempt to disguise Frank Miller's death as an accident began to fall apart almost immediately. Investigators arrived at the scene within hours of the car being found, and something about the way the vehicle was positioned raised questions. The supposed crash lacked the violence expected from a late-night collision. The airbags had not deployed, and the injuries on Frank's body did not align with the story of an accident. Blood patterns hinted at something far more sinister. What should have been dismissed as a tragic mishap quickly became the start of a criminal investigation. Back at the Miller home, Emily tried to maintain her composure, rehearsing answers in her mind, convincing herself that she could hold the lies together. Yet every word she spoke carried the tremor of guilt. Detectives interviewed her carefully, noting her evasive responses and the way her eyes darted whenever her father's whereabouts were mentioned. Neighbors were questioned as well, and it did not take long for someone to mention seeing Frank slip out of his home late at night, often toward Marcus Reed's house. The whispers that had once been confined to Emily's private thoughts began to spread across the neighborhood, forming a picture that no longer matched the image of the perfect officer and family man. Forensics sealed the fate of the cover-up. Fibers from Emily's blanket were discovered on Frank's clothing, blood traces were found inside the house, and footprints revealed the path taken when his body was dragged to the garage. Marcus's involvement became undeniable when fingerprints tied him to Frank's car and faint traces of his DNA were recovered from the Miller living room. The carefully constructed image of Marcus as an innocent neighbor collapsed under the weight of the evidence. When confronted, Emily's fragile story broke apart. Investigators uncovered weeks of online searches on her laptop, detailing questions about knives, cover-ups, and even inquiries about how long it took for bodies to be discovered in staged accidents. Notes she had written in a private journal revealed her growing hatred toward her father, filled with angry scribbles and timelines of his late-night disappearances. The pages painted a picture of obsession, rage, and careful planning that prosecutors would later use against her. The community, once shocked by Frank's sudden death, was left reeling as the truth unfolded. The respected officer who had preached authority and order had been living a double life, sneaking into the arms of the very young man he publicly despised. The daughter who had grown up in the shadow of his control had turned into his killer, driven not only by betrayal but by the weight of years of resentment. Marcus, caught between secrecy and survival, was dragged into the nightmare, his life permanently stained by his connection to the affair. The case became a media storm, each headline more sensational than the last. It was not just the murder of a police officer. It was the exposure of a fractured family and the hypocrisy of a man who had hidden his truth behind a badge. The suburb that once seemed so peaceful became a symbol of how easily appearances can deceive, how beneath manicured lawns and polite smiles lie secrets capable of destroying lives. When the trials concluded, the story left behind no victors. Emily faced the consequences of her actions, her future defined by the night she let her fury dictate her fate. Marcus, though not the one who wielded the knife, was forever tied to the scandal, his name dragged through the mud of public opinion. And Frank, once respected, was remembered not for his service but for the secret that cost him everything. The tragedy left the community unsettled, a chilling reminder that even in the quietest neighborhoods, darkness waits behind closed doors, ready to erupt when secrets are finally exposed.